Hello, listeners. I hope you're all well. This is Mr. Jake, bringing you a special selection that will have you on the edge of your seats. Today, I present terrifying tales never before told by truckers, stories that travel the highways from the Dominican Republic to Canada. These are first-person experiences where the everyday transforms into the unexpected and the unknown comes to life under the darkness of the night. Adjust your headphones, turn off the lights, and join me on this suspenseful and terrifying journey. Welcome to a journey into the unknown, where legends come to life and every mile could be the last. Let's begin. Good evening to all the listeners of this podcast. My name is Olivardo. I'm 42 years old, and I'm currently a full-time truck driver. I came to this profession after losing my old job in a factory, and although I struggled to adapt at first, I quickly discovered that I enjoyed traveling long distances. I basically transport whatever they tell me to, although, to be honest, what I'd like is to be able to work in something that leaves me more time at home. The normal thing is to go to a port, to transport a container, or to a mining area, to transport raw materials, construction materials for ongoing projects, or even debris from a demolition site. The truth is, for me, there isn't much of a difference. This job has become too exhausting lately, and it frustrates me a lot that I've missed so many moments with my daughter because I've been traveling, her first words, her first steps. Every time I think about everything I've missed, I feel a mixture of sadness and guilt. I dream of those special moments, and the thought of not having been there to share them weighs heavily on me. It's as if time is slipping away, and I can't get it back. These are things that, as a parent, you dream of witnessing, and it's something I feel my job has robbed me of. However, the reason I finally decided to quit is something that happened very recently, something that left its mark on me. I live in Culiacan, in the state of Sinaloa, but my job requires me to travel to several states: Chihuahua, Durango, Jalisco, Michoacán, Tamaulipas. I've traveled to so many states in Mexico that, honestly, it's harder for me to say which ones I've been to than which ones I haven't. This happened when I was near the city of Tecate, passing through a famous highway known by the name of La Rumorosa. Honestly, nothing strange had ever happened to me before that time. I was on my way home after finishing transporting a load of construction materials and was feeling truly exhausted after a long month of traveling and very little time at home. It was even more exhausting to think about the long road ahead, considering I was currently in the state of Baja California. Although I want to quit this job as soon as possible, I've always been known for doing my job well, regardless of my displeasure. So, regardless of physical or mental exhaustion, I was focused and attentive while driving. However, I don't know if it's because of the same exhaustion I just mentioned, but there was a moment on that road where I felt somewhat unfocused. It was strange. My mind was completely blank, and no matter how focused I was on the road, it was as if something had taken control of me. I'd love to say I didn't see anything when that woman crossed the road, but if I'm being completely honest, I'd be lying. I saw her very clearly, but whatever was happening to me didn't let me realize I could actually hit her, and I kept accelerating. It felt something like when you wake up from a nightmare and reality blends into the dream. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears, and my chest burned with lack of air. As I took a deep breath, I felt the chill of the night air filling my lungs, as if I were coming back from a deep abyss. Only then did I realize I wasn't even breathing. I quickly grasped what was happening to me and slammed on the brakes as hard as I could. The problem was, I did it too late, and while I managed to brake in time to stop the truck from running over the woman's body, I didn't brake in time to prevent it from crashing. I saw the woman practically in slow motion as she flew from the point of the collision to a few meters ahead. As soon as the truck came to a complete stop, I quickly got out and ran to help her, if necessary, which I firmly believed was the case. I was prepared to put her in the truck and rush to the nearest hospital, no matter where that was. When I reached the woman who had landed with a rough and noisy crash, I was very glad that she was at least conscious because I noticed she was crying. although I found it a bit odd that she didn't have any scrapes on her skin, considering she was wearing a short, sleeveless dress. I quickly started asking her questions to try to figure out where she had hurt herself, but at that moment, I began to hear strange voices in the vicinity. I understand that you might hear the sound of crickets or the occasional insect, but it was still strange. I was sure I could clearly hear whispers, although I couldn't make out what they were saying. Suddenly, I had a somewhat strange feeling, as if I were being watched by many people. At that moment, I realized how odd the situation was, a woman alone in the middle of nowhere, walking. It definitely sounded suspicious. I looked around, thinking this could probably be one of those gangs that set up traps on the roads to rob drivers, but everything was so dark that I couldn't notice anyone. "Little girl, I'm going to take you to the hospital," I said as I tried to pick her up. Suddenly, I heard her crying get so loud that I felt a sharp pain in my ears, and I took a few steps back. In the glare of the truck's headlights, I could see her face clearly, and what I saw shocked me deeply. Her skin had a sallow, almost translucent tone, and her eyes were disproportionately large, with elongated pupils that reflected the light unnaturally. Her cheeks were hollow, and her thin lips formed a grimace that seemed frozen between pain and fury. There was something inhuman about her expression, a mixture of menace and desperation that paralyzed me for a moment. The first thing I have to say is that she was hideous. I'm not one to judge by appearance, but it was really hard not to think about that when I saw her face. The shape of her face reminded me of a cat, and the fury in her gaze was undeniable. "Look, I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me, but I'm going to take you to a hospital, and I'll take responsibility for everything," I said nervously. Her expression made me think her fury wasn't about what had just happened. When I was close enough to take her in my arms, she let out a scream that made me step back and cover my ears with my hands. Just then, he stood up, and I noticed one of his arms was bent in a completely unnatural way, as well as one of his ankles, and finally, his neck. I couldn't help but wonder if anyone could still be alive with their neck like that, but, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he straightened it again. I started to feel very nervous seeing this and backed up toward the truck, but she started following me. It didn't take me long to turn around and run toward the truck. As soon as I managed to get in and close the door, she smashed the window with a bang and began scratching my face like a cat. It was impossible to shake her off, so I hit the gas. After reaching a certain speed, she couldn't keep going and fell. I looked in the rear-view mirror at where she had fallen, and what I saw left me speechless. I saw her on the ground and witnessed her literally turn into a cat. I had the bad luck of encountering a nagual. Naguales, according to Mexican tradition, are human beings with the ability to transform into animals through the use of magic. They are figures surrounded by mysticism and fear, known for being vengeful and dangerous to those unfortunate enough to cross their path. The walk home seemed endless. Every time I saw a stray cat, my heart would race. Despite having managed to escape, I couldn't help feeling like something was watching me from the shadows, even in my own home. The feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. There were nights when I heard strange meows around my house, as if the cats were gathering for something. One day, weeks after what had happened, I found a long scratch on my truck door that hadn't been there the night before. This confirmed my fears. It wasn't over. I lived on alert, wondering when I would cross paths with that being again, or if it would ever appear at my house. The terror wasn't just on the road, it was now part of my daily life. On the way home, every time I saw a stray cat, I would get really nervous and avoid it. I've heard that people who can turn into animals can be very spiteful and vengeful, and I really don't want something to happen to me on a highway in the middle of nowhere where no one could help me. Many people often have very misconceptions about some aspects of my job. Some occasionally say it's too easy, others that it's not a source of stress at all, and generally, these are arguments made out of ignorance. Some even claim that being a truck driver is just about driving, without realizing the long hours, responsibilities, and risks we face every day. However, only those of us who work this job daily can realize many aspects of this job that aren't usually talked about, from the mental strain to the lonely moments on the road. We know how important small moments of peace are to keeping us sane. We're also aware of how stress can accumulate and sometimes transform into something we carry with us even off the road. Good evening to all the listeners of this podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Luis Alfonso, and I'm a truck driver from Tijuana. Normally, my job is to transport goods across the border with the United States, but occasionally I also transport goods into the interior of Mexico. These occasions are rare, but they also bring their own challenges. That occasion was one of the few times I had to transport goods into the interior of Mexico. I had to transport a load from Tijuana to the city of Hermosillo in the neighboring state of Sonora, a journey that, although it didn't involve crossing the border, represented a different challenge. The idea of traveling through unfamiliar territory made me somewhat uneasy, but also curious. It was a long trip, but, in my mind, I thought that at least I wouldn't have to endure the tediousness of crossing the border with its long lines and strict checkpoints. I could have some time to relax a bit and drive calmly, since delivery times in Mexico were less strict than those across the border. However, lack of familiarity with internal routes remained a concern. It's not normal for me to travel across state lines, so I didn't really know any routes. I had to rely entirely on GPS to get to my destination, which, while easy for some people, is tedious for me. Not knowing the route meant being on my toes at all times, which added an additional level of stress to the trip. Because of this, as soon as I had the opportunity to refuel at a gas station, I decided to take advantage of the time it would take to completely fill the truck's enormous tank. I looked for a quiet spot where I could be alone and take the time to smoke a cigarette. These small moments of respite are essential for anyone who spends long hours on the road. My wife has often urged me to quit, but it's irresistible when I'm feeling stressed, like I was that time. Smoking gives me a sense of control, a small respite amidst the long hours of driving and the constant tension of meeting deadlines. It's as if each puff dissipates a bit of the day's accumulated burden. It was nighttime, and the warmth that ran through my body after each puff was soothing. At those moments, it seemed like nothing bad could happen. I guess I'd relaxed too much, because after a couple of minutes, someone suddenly came and sat down next to me. The guy who arrived asked me for a cigarette, which I gladly gave him. There was something about his presence that, although calm, was somewhat unsettling, perhaps because he appeared so suddenly. He was another trucker, escaping the stress of the road, basically a comrade in arms. We quickly got along, sharing anecdotes about our respective days. I stayed talking to him for a while, until the gas station attendant told me my truck was ready. I said goodbye to the guy and told him that if I saw him again, I would buy him a beer, but he told me not to worry, as I would see him again, but that at that moment he wouldn't be able to accept that beer. There was something in his tone that puzzled me. It was as if he knew something I didn't. I was somewhat confused, but he casually responded with something that left me even more confused. Up ahead, in the ravine you're about to encounter, my truck fell. He said it so casually that it seemed like a joke.
It took me a few seconds to realize the guy wasn't joking, and after a brief moment of silence, he casually told me that he had died there a couple of years ago. My initial laughter, albeit nervous, faded when I saw the guy simply disappear before my eyes. It was such a surreal moment that I felt a chill run through my body. When I returned to the filling station to get into my truck and leave, the attendant looked at me with a strange expression. He didn't say anything, but he seemed to understand why I was so distraught. Without saying a word, I paid him the money and quickly left. I didn't want to stay there another minute. "Sir, don't you stop when you reach the ravine up ahead," the guy told me. I could guess why he was giving me that advice, and after what I had witnessed, I wasn't going to ignore his warning. As I drove, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I told myself it could have been a hallucination or fatigue. Still, my heart pounded, and my nervousness drove me to speed up without realizing it. When I finally reached the ravine, I slowed down. The place was exactly as the man had described. a dangerous stretch with sharp turns and a seemingly endless drop. As I drove as carefully as I could, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing by the side of the road, was the same man. Although I didn't look closely enough to recognize it was him, something was different. His eyes were as black as night, and his paler skin than before gave off a cadaverous look. I felt a knot in my stomach. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It seemed like he was watching me too. Despite my fear, I forced myself to maintain control of the truck and keep going. The tension was such that I felt the journey would never end. Finally, I managed to cross the stretch, and, when I looked in the rearview mirror, the man had disappeared. I don't know how I managed it, but I kept driving to a safer place where I could pull over. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself, but the memory of those black eyes haunts me to this day. I've heard stories where encounters like this end much worse, so, although terrified, I consider myself lucky to have escaped unscathed. However, every time I drive near a ravine, I can't help but remember that night and think about the mysteries hidden on Mexico's lonely roads. There are lessons one learns too late. Sometimes prudence compels us to ignore certain impulses, but there are nights when something within us pushes us to continue when the wisest thing to do would be to turn back. My name is Miguel, and if you're reading or listening to my story, perhaps you can avoid a fate similar to mine. I'm a truck driver, originally from Huancayo, but I spend most of my days traveling along various highways in the Central Sierra. Once, I accepted a job that would take me along an isolated road near Tarma, and although I didn't think much of it at first, that trip marked my life forever. That night, everything seemed normal. I'd been traveling similar routes for years, facing landslides, torrential rains, and even unexpected mudslides, but nothing had prepared me for what I would encounter on that journey. It was close to midnight when I set off for a hamlet located about 2 hours from the city of Tarma. I had to deliver construction supplies, nothing out of the ordinary. Everything started off peacefully. A bit of icy wind, a relatively clear route, and the typical solitude of the Sierra at night. The GPS indicated a detour that was barely visible on the map, but it was the fastest route. The road, at first, was wide and in good condition. The truck's headlights illuminated the edges of the road, revealing bushes and a few scattered stones. However, as I continued, the asphalt began to disappear, giving way to stony, bumpy terrain. I felt a slight discomfort, but I ignored it. It's just a rough patch, I told myself. As I passed through a particularly tight stretch of road, with tall trees on both sides, I felt the wind suddenly stop. I turned off the radio to better examine my surroundings. An eerie silence fell over the truck, as if all of nature around it was holding its breath. Even the sound of the tires on the rock seemed muffled. Suddenly, I noticed a white glow in the rearview mirror. I pulled over, thinking it might be a sign reflecting the light from my headlights. When I got out, the air had a strange, sweet, and slightly acrid smell, like something organically rotting. I discovered something I never thought I'd see. A gigantic spiderweb covered a good portion of the nearby bushes. The texture of the threads against the light revealed a greasy sheen that made me think of metal, as if they were made of rusty wire. I was about to get closer to get a better look when I saw a shadow moving quickly through the thicket. A shiver ran through me. It must have been a fox or a dog, I told myself, trying to calm down. I returned to the truck and resumed driving. As I continued, the road began to descend through a foggy area. I had trouble focusing my vision, and for a moment, I swore I'd seen a dark shape running on 2 legs along the shoulder. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, unsure if what I'd seen was real or simply a product of my fatigue. As I descended, the fog thickened. I could barely see more than a few meters in front of the truck. I turned on my high beams, but that only made the fog shine, creating a blinding effect. I was starting to feel like something wasn't right. The next thing happened in a way that not even my wildest nightmares could recreate. I crossed a narrow bridge. In the middle, the engine jerked sharply, and the truck died. No matter how hard I turned the key, the engine wouldn't respond. The moon was barely a faint silver arc, illuminating the bridge. I got out to check the hood with a flashlight in hand. That's when I noticed something stuck to the rear tires. Thick strands of spiderweb were clogging the wheels. Then, to my left, a cavernous roar made my hair stand on end. I shone the flashlight and saw, just a few feet away, the silhouette of an enormous creature, standing upright, with dark fur covering its limbs. Its arms were almost as long as its legs, and from its face emerged a pair of red eyes that stared at me with primal fur. I had never believed in legends like Bigfoot, but there he was, staring at me, paralyzed with fear. I backed into the driver's seat and closed the door. I couldn't start the truck, so I turned on my high beams. The beast covered its face and let out another powerful growl that echoed throughout the valley. I tried to maintain my composure, but my mind kept repeating one word: escape. Just then, I felt something slithering up my arm. It was a spider, much larger than normal, scurrying nimbly, leaving a slimy trail on my sleeve. A cold sweat immediately broke out, and I felt my heart pounding desperately, almost as if it were about to burst out of my chest. I swatted it away and, to my horror, saw fine strands of webbing beginning to form on the window, as if dozens of spiders were wrapping themselves around the truck. My hands shook as I tried to think of what to do, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Outside, Bigfoot was pacing impatiently, surrounded by tiny glimmering lights that I guessed were the eyes of giant arachnids reflecting the light. It seemed like an impossible collaboration. The beast and the spiders were blocking my only escape route. With a burst of adrenaline, I gripped the steering wheel and turned the key once more. After several failed attempts, the engine roared, breaking free from the sinister silence. I put it in gear and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The truck jerked forward, tearing the cobwebs from the tires. I watched in the rearview mirror as the creature leaped to try and catch up, clawing at the air. I didn't know if it was fury or desperation, but its roar pierced my eardrums. I managed to cross the bridge and continue along the winding road. I didn't stop until I reached an abandoned toll booth hours later, as the first light of dawn broke. Fear remained trapped in my chest, and my mind kept reliving the image of that beast, and that legion of spiders weaving their traps in the darkness.
From that day on, I never dared return to that stretch of mountain range. Every time I hear someone talk about seeing something strange on the roads of Tarma, I feel an uncontrollable chill. That experience taught me a clear lesson. Some roads should not be taken, not only because of their danger, but because what you might find on them could be worse than any danger imaginable. In life, there are events that take our dreams to dark places, inexplicable experiences we'd rather forget. My name is Rodolfo, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the early 1990s, when I lived in a small town in the Dominican Republic. Back then, the nights were truly silent, and the roads were barely lit by the occasional yellowish light. We were always told to be cautious when traveling on the road that led to the coast, a remote path surrounded by bushes and abandoned coffee plantations. It was rumored that several people had gone missing in that area, and that some drivers had seen strange things at night, like shadows crossing the road or unexplained lights. However, we never imagined that the worst warning would fall short of what awaited us. In my memory, that road had always had a peculiar air, as if it hid secrets that no one dared reveal. The abandoned coffee plantations that surrounded it had been the scene of stories of apparitions and strange encounters, but for us, young and daring, there was no room for fear. We trusted in our luck and our ability to face anything that came our way. That night, my three best friends, Tony, Cecilia, and Pedro, and I went for a walk after a local dance that left us eager to continue the evening. The only problem was that the next town was a few kilometers away, and the few cars that passed had taken another route. Without giving it much thought, we decided to venture down the dark road on foot, chatting and laughing to chase away the drowsiness of the early morning. The heat was humid, typical of the coastal area, and a distant murmur accompanied us, the swaying of the palm trees and the occasional night cricket. The breeze carried with it the salty aroma of the nearby sea, mixed with the faint smell of wet earth. Everything changed when, suddenly, the sky lit up with a greenish glow. We stopped talking immediately, startled. The air became thick, filled with an unsettling silence, broken only by a faint hum in the air. We watched as 3 lights moved in sync, forming a triangle high in the celestial vault. The temperature seemed to drop slightly, and a strangely cold breeze brushed our skin, making us shiver. It was nothing like an airplane or any star we'd ever seen before. They moved quickly, changed direction abruptly, and seemed to emit a faint hum that resonated in the air. I tried to remain calm. Maybe it's some atmospheric phenomenon, or military personnel practicing, who knows. But my friends weren't so convinced. Cecilia grabbed my arm and murmured that we should continue, that it wasn't a good idea to stay out there in the elements. Tony, for his part, took out a small flashlight and turned it on. Its light was poor, but at least it guided us. We took a few steps in the darkness when an earthquake struck, nearly knocking us to the ground. The pavement creaked, and for a few seconds we felt a dull rumble, as if the island's very heart were pounding. It took barely half a minute for the shaking to cease, leaving us on edge. The ground felt hot for a few moments, as if something beneath us had moved. Did it just shake, or was it me? Pedro asked in a trembling voice we'd never heard before. It was real, and so are those lights, Tony murmured, pointing at the sky. To our surprise, the lights remained static now, as if they were watching us. That's when something even more inexplicable happened. Figures appeared on the horizon, humanoid silhouettes with strangely elongated heads that swayed from side to side, approaching with slow but determined steps. They didn't utter a word, nor was there the slightest sound. They almost seemed to float, although when I looked closely, I could see their movement. We felt a collective chill, as if invisible ice were running down our spines, paralyzing our thoughts for a second. Unwilling to agree, we began to run, our hearts pounding in our ears, and the overwhelming feeling that something incomprehensible and dangerous was stalking us. The road was a lonely stretch, lined with thick bushes and half-abandoned plantations. We ran aimlessly, seeking only to get away from those impossible shapes. But the further we advanced, the more the figures seemed to appear before us. Their heads seemed disproportionate, and in the dimness, we could make out thin, elongated faces. Their limbs moved unnaturally, as if each step slipped into the darkness. I felt my throat burn, both from the effort of running and from the anguish. Cecilia clung to my hand, sobbing, while Pedro and Tony walked a little further ahead, shouting our names so they wouldn't lose sight of us. Every so often, we turned around. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, projecting shapes that confused our perception. In a moment of desperation, Tony stopped dead in his tracks and shone his flashlight on one of the figures. We saw a fleeting glimpse of large, dark, lifeless eyes. They didn't seem to blink. A shiver ran through us all at once, as if the air itself had turned ice cold. Cecilia took a step back with a stifled sob, while Pedro mumbled a hurried prayer under his breath. I felt my legs tremble, as if my body couldn't decide between freezing or running away. It was a sight we should never have seen, something that defied everything we knew. We closed formation to keep running, convinced that if anyone fell behind, they would be at the mercy of these beings. The chase continued for what seemed like an eternity, although in reality, it was only a few minutes. We reached a small hamlet where the road widened slightly, and to our relief, we saw the light of an old bar that was still open. We headed in without a second thought. The patrons and the owner stared at us in astonishment. Panting, Tony and I shared the little we could explain. No one dared to laugh. The eyes of those present held more astonishment than mockery. One of the men, in a serious tone, simply said, "I've seen them before." We stayed in the bar until dawn. None of us dared to leave, and the distant sound of the wind in the plantations kept us on edge. Before leaving, the bar owner gave us a disturbing warning. Don't come back that way at night. Not everyone makes it out. We never knew if it was an encounter with beings from another planet, ancestral spirits, or some kind of collective hallucination brought on by the earthquake. However, that night changed our lives forever. Although we continued with our daily routines, none of us traveled that road in the dark again. The green lights in the sky and those elongated heads taught us that the world can hide secrets that reason can't always explain. Every time I stopped to recall the episode, I experienced the same chill I felt then. Many years later, people in the Dominican Republic still talk about strange phenomena on lonely roads, sudden tremors, and unexplained silhouettes. I wonder if these events are a reminder that the universe holds unfathomable mysteries that we are destined to contemplate but never fully understand. Perhaps, in our search for answers, the most important thing is not to unravel the causes, but to accept that there are things that defy the boundaries of our reason. For my part, I know that what I experienced that night was as real as the humid heat that enveloped us. And if ever, walking along a dark road, you feel an unexpected tremor and see lights moving in the sky, don't ignore the warning. There are things out there we are not prepared to understand. Sometimes, you feel like life opens up before you when you decide to embark on a new path. My name is Edwin, and I grew up in Lima, Peru, where I dreamed of a more prosperous future for my family. One day, browsing the internet, I came across an ad for a Canadian agency looking for experienced truck drivers. Without hesitation, I applied, and within months, I received confirmation. They were waiting for me on the other side of the world. The process was dizzying, endless paperwork to fill out, tense interviews where every answer felt like a step forward or backward, and the interminable wait to obtain the visas that would seal our fate. 6 months later, my wife, daughter, and I landed in Canada, ready to start over. The first few days were exciting, but also tough. The cold was chilling to the bone, especially for those of us from a coastal climate. The walks to my daughter's school were a constant challenge, with knee-deep snow and a biting wind that chilled our cheeks. However, I made progress adapting, and soon I obtained my local license. That's how I began working for a trucking company that covered long routes from British Columbia to Alaska. I never imagined that on one of those journeys, I would stumble upon something that would shake all my beliefs. It was the dead of winter, a dark night with a light snowfall. I had to transport a load of toys to a remote Alaskan location. Although the road was icy and slippery, I felt confident behind the wheel. The isolation of the road could be overwhelming. Miles of forest, snow, and absolute silence, broken only by the roar of the engine and the wind. Often, to stay awake, I turned on the radio, but that night the signal was so weak that all I heard were fragments of songs and static. I'd been driving for several hours when my GPS marked a particularly lonely stretch. As I rounded a curve, the semi's high beams illuminated something in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it might be a moose or some other animal typical of the area, but I noticed it wasn't moving an inch. My heart started beating faster as I slowed down. I slowed down to a near stop. The silhouette began to take shape, an upright being, much taller than a normal human, covered in thick, dark fur. The crunch of the snow beneath my tires echoed in the absolute silence, accompanied by a faint ringing in my ears that intensified my nervousness. From my seat, a musty, somewhat stale smell seemed to seep through the cracks, mixing with the frigid air in the cabin. A shiver ran through me as I realized it wasn't moving away. Despite the noise of the engine and the dazzling lights, it seemed to be looking at me with an intelligence I didn't associate with a wild animal. For a moment, I felt my blood run colder than the snow itself. I wanted to avoid it, but the road was too narrow, and the ice made any maneuver difficult. At the same time, I didn't want to hit that thing, whatever it was. I honked my horn insistently, but it remained motionless, as if challenging me. With each passing moment, fear gripped me. My heart felt like it was about to explode, unable to believe my eyes. The silence hung heavy in the air, and the sound of my own breathing grew increasingly labored. My hands shook as I searched for a solution, anything that might drive that creature away. That's when I remembered the emergency flare I kept in the cockpit. Maybe the light and the noise can scare it away, I thought. I cut the engine momentarily, took a deep breath, and ignited the projectile. Raising the flare, the wave of red light lit up the snowy night. The creature leaped backward, letting out a growl that echoed through the trees. In a flash, he was off running with astonishing agility, deep into the forest, leaving only a few long footprints in the snow. My heart was still pounding when I realized I'd frozen, clutching that almost extinguished flare. A distant howl, perhaps that of wolves, interrupted the silence, abruptly bringing me back to reality. After reacting, I started the truck again and continued on my way, my throat dry and a tingle of panic running down my spine. Every so often, I scanned the surroundings, fearing that the thing would return. When I reached my destination, I could barely sleep in the cabin. The image of the furry creature and its eyes fixed on me didn't leave my mind until well into dawn. As the days passed, I searched for information about alleged sightings. I was overcome by a mixture of disbelief and fascination as I read accounts from other witnesses, some as terrifying as my own. Each story left me with goosebumps and a feeling of smallness in the face of the vastness of this country and its secrets. I felt a knot in my stomach, imagining that what I had seen could always be so close, watching us from the shadows. I heard anecdotes from hunters, travelers, and indigenous people who described something very similar, a monster many call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I confess that, before emigrating, I never took those stories seriously, but now I know that in this land there are corners so vast and wild that they hide secrets impossible to imagine. Over time, routine returned, but with a different shadow. Today, I still work as a truck driver in Canada, and although I haven't encountered such an extreme situation again, I feel a little different every time I embark on a nighttime journey north. There's a part of me that still can't fully process what I saw, but another, more intuitive part whispers to me that there are many things we still don't know. And every time I watch the snow fall on the road, I remember that night and think about how many mysteries might be lurking in the darkness, waiting for us to pass by, to remind us how small we are in the face of the immensity of this world. Good night, Mr. Williams. Here's my story. In life, there are times when an apparent routine turns into a chilling event. My name is Manuel, and if you're reading this story, I want you to take it as a warning. No matter how well you master the wheel, Dominican roads hold secrets that can shake your certainties. I've been driving the Duarte Highway between Santo Domingo and Santiago for years, always enjoying the tropical scenery and the Caribbean breeze. Most of the time, the journey is peaceful, almost routine, except for a few traffic jams or minor events that fail to disrupt the peace of the journey. But there are rare and disturbing nights when the monotony is unexpectedly broken, transforming the ordinary into something absolutely terrifying. There are nights when reality seems to bend, and that's when you must trust your instincts to emerge unscathed. It was close to midnight when I left Santo Domingo for Santiago. I normally make this trip during the day, but this time I was late due to work. The road was relatively clear, with only a few vehicles passing me or traveling at slower speeds. The atmosphere was dense, the typical Caribbean heat, although the night breeze made it more bearable. I drove with the music low, paying attention to the road. Suddenly, I noticed a truck behind me with its high beams on. The intensity of the brightness made me squint, and a feeling of unease took hold. I felt a slight chill run down my spine, as if something besides the truck was following me in the darkness. The reflection in the side mirrors became almost blinding, forcing me to squint. Unease grew in my chest. It dazzled me so much that I had to adjust the rearview mirror. I considered pulling over to let it pass, but the vehicle remained glued, almost intimidating. I felt a tingle of discomfort and a touch of fear, so I accelerated to put more distance between us. However, the trailer wasn't moving away. It was still there, glued to my back. That's when I decided to push the accelerator harder. The speedometer needle climbed, and for a moment, I lost sight of the truck in the rearview mirror. Finally, I murmured, thinking it had swerved into another lane or braked. However, barely a few minutes passed, and it suddenly reappeared, this time much closer, as if it might crash into me at any second. I started to get nervous. I couldn't see anyone else on the road, not a single car that could serve as a witness. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my breathing quickening. I honked the horn a couple of times, as if that would persuade it to back off, but it didn't work. The truck persisted, projecting its lights onto my mirror and driving me to the brink of hysteria. In a fit of panic, I decided to pull over sharply, hoping it would pass me by. I braked carefully and pulled over, waiting a few seconds with the steering wheel firmly in my hands, convinced I'd hear an engine roar as he passed me. Before that night, I believed fear was something that only existed in stories told around a campfire. But I learned that true terror is that which infiltrates your reality and robs you of peace. It was past midnight, and the fog had grown so thick that, even with the headlights on, I could barely make out the outline of the road. Humidity seeped through the cracks in the car, and the air I breathed tasted metallic and heavy. The atmosphere was almost oppressively silent, as if all of nature had fallen into an expectant slumber. That silence was suddenly broken by a cry that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, or the wind carrying some sound, but the tone of the wail was too human, too heartbreaking to be a mere coincidence. Still, I slowed down. Something inside me told me not to ignore that sign. My heart began to beat faster, as if sensing something. I saw the silhouette of a woman dressed in white, stopped at the edge of the asphalt. She seemed unsteady, barely holding on with a slight wobble. My heart leapt. You don't often encounter people like that in the middle of nowhere, much less at this hour. There was something strange about the way she stood, as if the weight of her sadness was the only thing keeping her anchored to the ground. Carefully, I stopped the car a few meters ahead, rolled down the window, and yelled for her to help. I got no response. The woman kept her eyes fixed on the ground, emitting a short, gasping sob that made my skin crawl. I huffed and got out of the car, feeling a chill run down my spine. The air was freezing, and the fog seemed to envelop everything in a suffocating blanket. I looked around, searching for any sign that I wasn't alone on that desolate stretch of road, but there was nothing but darkness. I took a few steps toward the figure, trying not to startle her. Her shoulders trembled slightly, and her hands seemed to be desperately grasping at the air. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, noticing how her body hunched further as she listened to me. Then the woman jerked her head up, revealing a spectral face. Her eyes were just dark hollows, as if they had been gouged out. Her crying turned into a shrill scream that shook my ears and seemed to shake the very air around me. "My children!" she exclaimed in a heartbreaking voice that chilled me to the bone. I couldn't wrap my mind around what I was witnessing. Her face seemed to be carved from a mixture of pain and fury, and every word that came out of her mouth seemed to pierce my soul. I took a step back, my breath quickening, and ran back to the car. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine didn't respond. My only desire was to get away from that presence, but every attempt to start the car ended in a frustrating sputter. I glanced through the windshield and saw that the fog had closed in around the road. I could barely make out the woman's silhouette through the fogged-up glass. She had vanished, or so it seemed. Yet her cries continued to echo in the air, as if coming from everywhere at once. It was as if the air itself had become charged with her sadness, enveloping me in an atmosphere of pure despair. After a few seconds of anguish that seemed like an eternity, the engine finally roared and the headlights came back on. I pressed the accelerator and felt the tires slide slightly on the wet pavement, but I managed to get going. The crying, increasingly distant, continued to pierce my head until I left the curve behind and the fog began to slowly dissipate. I didn't see the woman again, nor her empty eyes, but the thunder of her scream still echoed in my ears. I arrived at my destination in a state of shock that took me hours to shake off. The next day, I tried to find some logical explanation. I considered the possibility that someone had prepared a costume to scare drivers, or that fatigue and fog had caused a hallucination. I clung to these ideas for days, but deep down I knew no answer was sufficient. However, the more I analyzed it, the more inconsistencies I found in my own theories. It was as if the fragments of the experience didn't quite fit together, leaving gaps my mind couldn't fill. Every attempt at a logical explanation only increased my unease, as if reliving it made it more incomprehensible and terrifying. Finally, I heard from locals that, for decades, Residents of Puebla have spoken of the presence of a woman who appears in that area during foggy nights, crying inconsolably for her lost children. Some claim it's La Llorona herself, others simply describe her as a tormented soul who can't find rest. Although I couldn't say who or what appeared to me that night, the truth is that my life was never the same after that encounter. Since then, every time I embark on a nighttime journey and am enveloped in fog, an uncontrollable chill takes hold of me as I remember the desperate cry of that eyeless woman. I could swear that, sometimes, the wind brings back that distant, my children. And it is then that I understand that there are experiences from which it is impossible to completely escape. Even now, as I write these lines, I feel her presence lurking in the corners of my memory, like a reminder that fear cannot be so easily dismissed.